about 30th attempt I've done using, trying to figure out what microphone I wanted to use. I've ended up picking this one because I think it sounds the best out of the options I had. So this is going to be, I'm going to make this as quick as possible, okay? I can't say it's going to be any good, or, well, it will be good, don't worry, but I can't say it's going to be short. But I'm just going to run through this as quickly as possible, give as much information as I can, and yeah, kind of go from there. So before I even begin, if you can name these two boats and which is which, I'll give you a high five or something. Okay? Okay, so let's get into this. So, what defines a battleship versus a battle cruiser? So, a battleship can be seen in the bottom right, is a heavily armed and protected warship that is able to take multiple hits while continuing to fight. So they are built with competitive guns, usually about, I think the common was 15 inch. And when I say 15-inch like guns, that is the width of the shell. The shells typically are about 1500, somewhere in the range of like 1500 to over 2,000 pounds per shell. So, and a battle cruiser is designed to hunt cruisers and smaller, quicker vessels. They carry battleship caliber guns, as seen in the top right, but they have much thinner armor. The only exception to that is the ship right there. That's HMS Hood. Hood had a similar armor scheme to Bismarck, but other battle cruisers that the British had, such as Repulse and Renown, had much thinner armor belts. And when I say armor belt, there's your citadel is at the heart of your ship. That's where your engine rooms are, where your shell storages are. If a shell uh, breaks through your belt and goes in there, it will cause a lot of damage. So notable battleships include HMS Warspite, USS Iowa, IJN Yamato, which was the largest battleship of all time, and KMS Bismarck, as you can see in the bottom right. Notable battle cruisers: HMS Hood, which is in the top right, HMS Repulse, HMS Renown, and the Congo class. I'll get into those battle cruisers, just not the Congo class. Okay, so because this is mostly looking at the state of the British Navy, and the next ships you'll see are in the British Navy, I figured I'd just give you an overview of what they had at the time. So the British had 22 capital ships at the start of the war. They had 15 battleships and 7 aircraft carriers. The battleships, or battle cruisers, which we'll get into, ranged from the Revenge class, the Queen Elizabeth, the Nelson's, Hood, and the Renown class. And the carriers, they were all different except for the Courageous class. You had HMS Eagle, HMS Hermes, HMS Ark Royal, HMS Argus, and then the 3 Courageous class aircraft carriers. I'm also going to be talking about the Illustrious class, but we'll get into that. So, the first battleships to talk about are the Queen Elizabeth class. There were 5 of them built, and all 5 served throughout World War II. Only 4 of them survived the war. At the at their creation, the time of their creation, they were the cutting edge for World War One. 4 of them took place at the Battle of Jutland. One of them did not. One of them was in Britain for some reason, while the biggest battle of World War One was going on. HMS Queen Elizabeth has the motto "Always the Same." Did not do that much during World War II. She was mostly escorting convoys. I can't think of a battle that she was actively participating in. HMS Malaya, which is the only Queen Elizabeth that was not renovated throughout the war, so she was the slowest. She has the motto, "I bring evil to the evil." She was present during a few battles against the Italians in the Mediterranean, and she did not play a major role in those battles because she was too slow to catch up to the action. In a shelling of an Italian city in the north of Italy, they accidentally misfired and fired a armor-piercing shell into the city, and it went through the roof of a cathedral. The shell did not explode. It's actually a monument now. HMS Valiant, whose motto is Vigilant and Valiant, was active throughout the war, notably in the Mediterranean. She was there at Cape Matapan with Barham and Warspite. She would be mined in 1941, refloated, and then her service pretty much ended in a accident where they brought her into a floating dry dock and they miscalculated it and the dry dock collapsed, and that pretty much damaged her enough to where she was done after that. HMS Barham was also active in the Mediterranean along with the other Queen Elizabeths. She was there during Cape Matapan, but she was sunk in 1941 on her way to Alexandria. She was struck by 3 torpedoes to the port side, I believe, and she is the only Queen Elizabeth to have sunk. And finally, there's HMS Warspite, whose motto is "I despise the hardships of war." I will get into Warspite later. There's a whole slide on her herself. So let's move on. The next is the R class. It goes by Revenge or just the R's. There were 5 built. There's Revenge, Resolution, Royal Oak, Royal Sovereign, and Ramillies. They were all built in similar designs to the Queen Elizabeths, but were cheap. They were cheaper to build. They had a little thinner armor. They were slower, so they didn't have that big of a impact on the war, especially World War II. None of them really had important careers, I will not lie. There were a few of them at the Battle of Jutland in World War I, but we're looking at World War II. So HMS Revenge and Resolution are actually responsible for carrying British gold to Canada to pay for the Lend-Lease program in 1940. Revenge is also responsible for being the only British battleship in the English Channel when Operation Sea Lion was to take place, which was the German planned amphibious invasion of Britain. Um, Revenge would later go on and blow up a bunch of those boats that were still sitting at the dock. HMS Resolution uh, battled a bit with alongside Barham against the French battleship Richelieu, which I'll also talk about way later, in 1940 off the coast of Dakar, but was torpedoed during the battle, which rendered her inoperable to continue. So she was sent back. I think Barham stuck around a little longer, but they weren't having very much luck. Resolution would spend the rest of her career escorting convoys until she was scrapped. Royal Oak was torpedoed in October 1939, which was the second month of the war. She was the second British capital ship sunk during the war. She was sunk at Scapa Flow, which was the main naval base for the British at the time, and it would be. It would just a couple more defenses to not have U-boats sneak into your naval base. Finally, well, not finally, there was HMS Royal Sovereign, which was an escort battleship for most of her career. She was loaned to the Russians, I believe, in 1942 or 43. Um, it would be some time before they would receive it back. The British asked constantly for the battleship back from the Russians. They were finally given it back, and the condition that that ship was in, I think it went straight to the scrapyard. It didn't stick around very much long after that. It was rusted in so many areas. It was in very poor condition. So she went straight to the scrapyard. And finally, HMS Ramillies, who is noted to be in a couple of battles, but just like Malaya, she was too slow to keep up with the active engagements. Her most notable, well, um, my favorite instances of her is she was escorting a convoy, and these 2 German battleships saw the convoy but backed off because Ramillies was escorting it. Okay, so the courageous and renowned battle cruisers. We're going to talk about the courageous class first because the courageous classes were interesting to say the least. They were armed with the Courageous class was armed with 15-inch guns, but they had extremely like thin armor. They were quite quick, but in the way in which they were built, they were extremely fragile. So when like if you think about the British, they're surrounded by poor weather, and the waves and the sea are always just like ruthless. These things basically got tossed around nonstop. And I have here it says they were in line with like a wet spaghetti noodle of rigidness. They were so bad in like the North Sea and everything that the Admiralty changed them to aircraft carriers. In the bottom right, you can see one of them. So there were three of them. There was Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. Courageous is actually the first capital ship to be lost during the war. She was sunk on September 17th, 1939. She was out hunting U-boats, and she was sunk by a U-boat. Glorious was spotted and chased down by German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in a devastating loss for the British. This was after the British were evacuating from Norway. Furious ended up surviving the entire war. There she is in the bottom right. She kind of had a wild career. She was all over the place. There were two Renown class battle cruisers, Renown and Repulse. You can see them in the top right. They are also actually I won't get into that. I won't get into that. But you can see Repulse is in the front and Renown is in the back. I know that. Don't ask me how I know that. But Repulse, the ship in the front, was active in the first couple of years of the war, escorting convoys. She was sunk in 1941 off the coast of Malaysia, along with HMS Prince of Wales, who we'll talk about later. And HMS Renown ended up surviving the entire war. She had multiple engagements in the North Sea and the Mediterranean, and she was sent off to the Pacific Ocean when the British finally got there. Okay, so the Nelson class are known as they carried the largest guns in the Royal Navy. There is one exception to that. Super quickly, HMS Furious, who is that aircraft carrier, when she was still a cruiser, the British designed this like 18-inch single-barreled gun for her that fired this ridiculously heavy shell. I can't remember what it was, but I'm not counting that. So I'm saying the Nelson class carried the largest guns in the history of the Royal Navy because they had them always. They're an interesting design because of the restrictions at the time. The Washington Naval Treaty, which I'll get into, basically you had to have your ships at a certain weight. So the British got super creative, and with this weird formation of the three guns in the front with a very strange looking bridge and everything after that. They were called Ugly Boots, and they were also referred to as Oilers, as Nelsol and Rodnell. So they had two screws, so they were quite slow, but in terms of armament, they were easily more than capable. They were able to fire, their shells ranged around 2,000 pounds, and they could accurately hit a target from 32,000 meters away. Their max firing range was about 39,000 yards or meters away, but it was not as accurate as a closer distance. I also know those guns had major teething problems for about 10 years, and the British had no idea what to do with them. But these ships really proved themselves in combat, with HMS Nelson being quite active in escorting duties and doing coastal bombardments later on in the war. And HMS Rodney, which is actually one of the more famous British battleships, she participated in the sinking of Bismarck, which was one of the ships on the second slide. She did a lot of heavy damage. She was extremely accurate. That was pretty impressive. She was also involved in the D-Day coastal bombardments, where she is said to have struck either a tank dead on or a group of tanks and turned them into absolute smithereens. Okay, the King George V class. These were not in my initial 22 number, but these came out in 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, and so on. There were five of them. They have the smallest guns of the British Navy. They have 14-inch guns, but they have the thickest armor belt. You can kind of see the armor belt. I don't know if you can see my mouse here. The It kind of like pokes out here. They have the thickest armor belt of any British battleship. They were Washington Treaty battleships. They were 35,000 tons, which was very bad because nobody else really followed the Washington Naval Treaty, unlike the British. The Americans, once they figured that the Japanese weren't going to follow it, the Americans started building battleships that were 42,000 tons, and then they got to their Iowas, which were about 60,000 tons. The Germans were building like 45,000 tons. The Italians were building 45,000 tons, and the Japanese were building about 75,000 ton the Yamato class battleships, which are just absolutely ridiculous. But I'm not going to get into that. So there were five of them in the war. Um, let's get into them. King George V helped sink the Bismarck along with Rodney. But there are instances where her shells could not penetrate Bismarck's armor. But she ended up having a successful career, shore bombardments and everything. Prince of Wales engaged Bismarck along with Hood, uh, but would go on to be sunk off the coast of Malaysia with HMS Repulse. It was sunk by about 80 Japanese planes. Duke of York sank Scharnhorst in the Battle of North Cape, which is north of Norway, in the pitch black. Anson and Howe, which were the fourth and fifth battleships to come out of this class, mostly had uneventful careers, nothing too big of note. And HMS Duke of York, the third ship of the class, notably had a ship cat named Whiskey. Okay, the illustrious class aircraft carrier, these were also not in my initial number, but these were the newest class of British aircraft carriers, and I wanted to mention them because they carried something actually kind of cool. They were smaller than their American counterparts. Their American counterparts could carry somewhere of, I'm taking a ballpark guess here, 70, 80. I know some Japanese aircraft carriers could carry like 100, but the British really hated parking their airplanes on the deck, so they would kind of stuff them all underneath. I know this picture they have them on here, but they like to go like this. So these were actually smaller. They could only carry about 36 aircraft underneath, but the engineering behind them, they were built with these thick flight decks, about 3 inches of solid steel. These armored flight decks, on very many occasions, ended up bailing out these aircraft carriers. Only one time that I can think of it failed, and that was Illustrious in the Mediterranean. I can't remember exactly how it happened, but it failed one time. Every time after that, Illustrious in the Pacific, Formidable in the Pacific, and Indomitable in the Pacific. That is Formidable actually in the top right there. After she took a kamikaze straight to her flight deck, the flight deck held. It was quite dented, but it survived. So, they were worked incredibly hard. They were in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. They were all over. They were absolute workhorses. Something that is interesting is Victorious was loaned to the Americans under the name USS Robin because at the time the Americans had one active aircraft carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean. And they asked the British, hey, can you please send us one? And the British were like, I guess. And there it is. All of them survived the war. They would be scrapped in the mid to late 50s, except Victorious would last until about the late 60s. So this is HMS Hood that I mentioned in the King George V and quite a bit earlier. This is the largest warship of the war. It's technically called an Admiralty class battle cruiser. It's a one of one. It went under the nickname the Mighty Hood because it was the most elegant and biggest. Well, it was kind of the fastest of the Royal Navy. Quite a formidable foe. It hunted for the Graf Spee and was part of the bombardment of the shelling of Mers el Kabir, which was the British shell bombardment of the French naval base when the French were surrendering. Um, by the time World War II came around, she was extremely beaten down. In between the two wars, she was going on around the world tours. She was the flagship of every fleet she was a part of. But by World War II, extremely beaten down. And in 1941, she engaged Bismarck at the Battle of the Denmark Strait, and one of these shells pierced through her armor deck, and it's believed it exploded in a ammunition locker, and the entire ship exploded within the first 10 minutes of that engagement. Okay, this is the last battleship ever built. I thought I'd talk about this one. This is HMS Vanguard. It was completed just after the war in 1946. Both sets of these guns that you can see, these ones, and then there's two more on the back here. Those are both from the Courageous class battle cruisers that were eventually turned into aircraft carriers. And she was, I believe, she was the last battleship standing by the time she was scrapped. I believe battleships were on their way out. The Americans had their own, but the British had pretty much scrapped all of theirs at this point. What is interesting is when they were pulling her out to be scrapped, she ran herself aground right in front of a British pub and refused to move for about 5 hours before they were able to pull her off of there, and then off she went to the breakers, unfortunately. Okay, here are some random facts that I found were super interesting, and I hope these are rapid fire, but I think I know they won't be. So the city of Ajax, Ontario, is actually named after a British cruiser. After the Battle of River Plate in 1939, in which three British cruisers took on a German pocket battleship, the township held a vote, and someone, I guess, put in the name Ajax, and Ajax was picked. Next, there was an HMS Canada. It wasn't owned by the Canadians. It was actually a British ship. It has its own very complicated history. It was actually a Chilean battleship. I think the British built it, owned it, and then they gave it to the Chileans or something like that. I don't know, but there was an HMS Canada at some point. I believe it was actually at the Battle of Jutland. I'd have to double check. HMS Revenge, who I was talking to as an R class. Oh, and also these pictures. The very top one, that's Ajax. The very bottom one, that's HMS Canada. And this one on the left here is Revenge. Uh, actually sunk a boat in the Halifax harbor by complete accident. Um, it was to be escorting a convoy out of the Halifax Basin, and they screwed up the timing of lowering the boom guards or something, or the torpedo nets. I can't remember which it was. And Revenge absolutely ran it over by complete accident. And so every time Revenge would come back to Halifax, people would make jokingly like abandon ship, like pretend to jump off their boat or something, as like a mockery. Anyways, lastly, Richelieu and Jean Bart were these two French battleships. They actually fought on both sides of the war. Initially for Vichy France, Richelieu fought Barham and Resolution off the coast of Dakar. Or, yeah. I think it technically won, but it's kind of inconclusive. And the Jean Bart engaged the USS Massachusetts during Operation Torch, which was the Allied invasion of North Africa. Well, pretty much after Operation Torch, they kind of flip side to the Allies. I thought that was interesting. More quick facts. There are very, very, very few times that an aircraft carrier actually uses her main deck guns against enemy ships. One of them was HMS Formidable at the Battle of Cape Matapan. They were hunting these Italian cruisers, and they fell into line. It was Warspite, Valiant, Formidable, and Barham. And the second they realized what they were doing, they were like, "Formidable, you got to get out of here. You're not built for this." So Formidable, I believe, actually opened fire a few times before absolutely dipping out of that battle line. I thought that was interesting. There were no battleships looking over Juno Beach, which was the Canadian beach at D-Day. There were cruisers, such as HMS Argonaut, and HMS Belfast. I know I'm missing a few. I can't remember who they were, but HMS Belfast is in the top right. Is actually a museum ship right now. You can go visit her in Britain. She's on that big river. I can't remember what it's called right now. Four ships were involved in the Denmark Strait. I've talked about three of them: Bismarck, Hood, Prince of Wales. There was actually a fourth one on the German side. She was Prince Eugen. She survived the entire war. She became American, so she was the USS Prince Eugen. And the Americans at the end of the war were like, we don't know what to do with this stuff. So they brought them all the way out into the Pacific Ocean, middle of nowhere, and dropped an atomic bomb on a bunch of these boats. Few of them survived, few of them didn't. Prince Eugen did. Then they dropped another one because they were like, let's keep testing. So dropped another one. Prince Eugen actually survived, but over time she flipped, and you can actually see her resting place now on the bottom there. I couldn't get a picture of these two, HMS Terror and Cerberus. I believe that's how you say it. They're these monitors with they're like a very small ship, but they have a battleship caliber gun, so they have about a 15-inch gun on this super small boat. They are hilarious looking. If you look them up, they are really, really funny. Okay, and finally, there was a cat that survived three sinkings and was given the name Unsinkable Sam. First, she was on Bismarck, which sank. Then the British got her. Then she was on HMS uh, Jarvis, I believe, which was sunk. The cat survived that. And then the cat was on Ark Royal, which was a British aircraft carrier. And Unsinkable Sam survived the entire thing. Apparently, his name was Oscar. After that sinking, the Ark Royal sinking, I guess they took Oscar, or Unsinkable Sam, and brought him to the Admiralty office, like on mainland Britain, and we're like, we're not putting him on a boat anymore. So that's kind of where he spent the rest of his life. They say he had like 6 lives left, something like that. Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned I'd talk about Warspite again. Here I am. Coolest ship ever facts. So Warspite, the Spite, or the Pite, whatever, who knows what it really is, but it's believed to be an old English word describing a woodpecker. The idea is, if you name a boat it's like the thought of poking holes into your enemy. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. I forgot to finish this. Uh, she was given the nickname Grand Old Lady, and there's a quote where she was shelling a Italian coast, and she was under like German and Italian like planes kept trying to hit her, but they couldn't in the middle of the night. And her captain, I can't believe I didn't finish writing this quote, wrote, "Operation carried out well. When the grand old lady lifts her skirt, she can run." By this time in the war, like she was somewhere in her 30s. Sorry if you can hear my chair. Yeah, my chair is needs to go to the dumpster. She was actually the first ship to open fire at D-Day. She was, oh, I can't remember what beach. It was either Gold or Sword. I can't remember. In 1940, she engaged German destroyers at a close quarters battle in the Narvik Fjords, which is a super interesting battle. She took an absolute beating at the Battle of Jutland during World War One. She took like 17 shells because her gearing engine or whatever overheated, and she was stuck in a starboard movement. So she went towards the enemy, and like this, she completed two big circles before just getting out of there and going home and to be repaired. 1940 as well, I believe. She engaged two Italian battleships at once, scoring one of the longest shell hits in the history of naval warfare, about 26,000 yards. Um, this is about tied with Scharnhorst hitting HMS Glorious. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was actually in Washington State, which is mainland U.S. She was getting a refit, I think, new sonars technologies. By the time she ended her career, she had 15 battle honors, 14 from World War II, which was the most of anybody else. It's not the most of all time, unfortunately. I believe USS New Jersey has the most. When she was being towed to be scrapped, because by the end of the war, she had taken such a beating. She had hit a mine. Um, she had taken uh, what's it called? I know it's a Fritz X. It's like an early development of a missile. She took one like directly into the center of like right here. She survived it, but there were everlasting issues. And if you'll notice in the initial picture of the Queen Elizabeth, that is also Warspite. Only 6 of her guns worked. The one turret did not work anymore, so she went to D-Day with one less gun. But yeah, when she was being towed to be scrapped, she she ran aground during a storm and refused to move. They tried refloating her. They tried like pulling her off. They tried pushing her. She would not move, so they ended up scrapping her in place, which took them about, I think, like 3 years or something. Okay, here's my last slide. These are some cool, interesting Canadian Navy facts. There are 2 museum ships from World War II from the Royal Canadian Navy that survived the war, HMS Sackville and HMCS Haida. And I should say a lot of Canadian ships survived the war. These are just the 2 that are remaining from old age and scrapping and everything. HMCS Ottawa, which is the 3rd picture, has the motto Ocean Beaver. HMCS Saskatoon, which is the 4th one, has a Cranberry Flats, which was, I believe, the captain's desk. The Canadians have a boat named Raven Moose. There's a couple more. There's like Orca, and there's Caribou, and there's a couple other. They're like these training boats. HMCS Athabascan, which is the 2nd picture there, during one of the wars in 1990, I believe it was the Iraq War. I cannot remember. HMCS Athabascan was in a support group, and she got called by an American cruiser that had run into a minefield. The Athabascan was specifically called for this mission. Um, Even though she wasn't the closest boat, she went out. She helped her American counterpart before a minesweeper came and guided the 2 of them out of there. In a goodwill movement, the Canadians hoisted up beer to the American cruiser because the American boats had been banned at that time. And the first 2 ships in the Royal Navy were the HMCS Niobe and HMCS Rainbow. So that is all I have for right now. Yeah, I don't know how long this was. I hope it wasn't too long. If you can actually name me what this class of cruiser is and what this class of cruiser is, there'll probably be questions on the test quiz thing. So yeah, thanks for listening.